Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research to Practice podcast. Today we have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Sarah Fiarman about her extensive work on school leadership. She currently has 3 books available with Harvard Education Press: Instructional Rounds in Education, Becoming a School Principal, and Unconscious Bias in Schools. Dr. Fiarman is a former teacher and leader and is currently a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, as well as on staff with the National Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity Project. So let's take it one book at a time. In my work, I suppose in your work as well, we work with a lot of principals along the continuum, those who are like novice and like mid-career, and then sort of the sort of veterans of principals who have upwards of 10 plus years of experience. And I want to start with like new principals, because that's the part where I find it's the most difficult part of leadership. Is you don't know what it's like to be a principal until you do it. Even if you're an AP for years, the moment you become principal, I found it was like a starkly different job, right, than I thought it was when I was an AP. And so what do you hope people learn from your book, or you have learned as far as supporting novice principals in trying to become highly effective?
Yeah, and I remember that was one of the first places where we really bonded as colleagues, was talking about our experience as new principals and how hard it was. Um, I think one of the essential qualities is basically just what you named, humility. And I think it's particularly tricky for new leaders because there's a sense that leaders are supposed to be the people with answers. And I know I felt that way when I first became a principal. I thought one of the things that I needed to do was ensure that people didn't find out that I actually didn't know the answers. You know, a lot of people call that imposter syndrome. Or so I think helping leaders understand that there are these messages that we get about what it means to be a leader that are not truth, and that we can question them. We can actually reclaim what it means to be a leader that's really aligned with our values. And I know some of my core values are learning and growth. And so I really wanted to support people to understand that can be a core value that you live out loud as a leader. I think that's really important, to be, as you said, public with our learning, and to recognize the impact it makes on others when we model that kind of learning. I think that's really powerful. I guess I also hoped in that book that I could share lessons I'd learned about really genuinely listening and being curious and empathetic to perspectives that were different from my own, and not entering with judgment first, which I think is often my tendency, maybe lots of people's tendencies, and to instead expect that I don't understand everything in this situation, and so let me be curious to hear what other people around me hear. So there were lots of things in that book. I mean, also just how do we really center students' needs as school leaders when most of our work involves working with adults, and often adults who are stressed out for various reasons, or who have their own needs and are coming to me with their own needs. And I remember somebody saying, as a principal, I wake up and I have a choice. I can do the right thing by students, or I can have an easy day. And thought, whoa, that's really a stark way of saying it. And I think there's some benefit in naming it that way first thing in the morning as I begin my job, to say, okay, let me not be lured into the easy decisions, the things that make my life easier. Let me remember that the reason I'm here is the interests of the students at my school. And in particular, students who are historically not well served in schools, Black and brown students, students with special needs, students who are multilingual students, all sorts of student groups that I really wanted to hold myself accountable for, making sure that the needs of my students in those subgroups and my whole school were really um, guiding my decisions, not my own comfort or the comfort of other adults. It's tricky.
Yeah.
Hard.
Yeah, it is. It's tricky and hard. And I want to sort of, as we go from like novice principals to sort of mid-career principals, and I'm saying in terms of my experience with mid-career principals, that those who have like 3 years or more of experience, and I'm saying this according to the research that I did when I was at UNC Charlotte, that the majority of principals at any given large urban school district have between 1 and 3 years of experience. So it's a very
Mm.
highly inexperienced leadership core in any given large urban district at any given time. And so a lot of folks are on that leadership journey. But once you make it past that third year, you get to the year 4 through maybe year 10, we'll say those are mid-career leaders, especially if they serve in the same school, they're not going to stay very long. What I find is, my issue with that I'm trying to get better at as a consultant, as a coach, is breaking up that us them mentality. As you mentioned, like I can do what's right by students, or I can have a good day, right? And what I find is that when these a lot of mid career leaders, whether it's principals or superintendents, get into these positions, they do have this sort of static view of like, all right, these are the detractors, and these are the ones who are on board. And there's always going to be detractors. There's nothing I can do. And so, a perspective that I encourage them to try on is really going back to their time as teachers and thinking about what did you do with the resistant learner, right? Students that wouldn't bring back their homework, a student that didn't do good on tests, a student who acted out rather than say that they didn't understand the curriculum. And they would say, I differentiate. I try to get to understand their mental block or their lack of ability to really buy into the curriculum and then to be successful in the course. And I'm like, all right, now let's level up to at the school level. If you're a principal, your classroom are now teachers, right? And you can't just write off teachers who aren't understanding your curriculum. You need to differentiate for them until they can get on board and you guys can join and move it forward. But I find it's very difficult to get folks out of that us then mentality. And when folks get stuck in it, it's something where it just makes our leadership journey so much harder. I don't know how you feel about that.
In terms of uh, this parallel between, as a teacher, thinking about how I best meet the needs of my students, and as a principal or school leader of some role, how do I best meet the learning needs of the adults in my building? I think I absolutely agree with that parallel. I think it's super important. And I think in the same way that there's more and more research about the importance of trust and relationship building and a sense of belonging and a sense of being fully seen and valued for students in classrooms. I think it's the same thing for adults as learners. And then it becomes the role of the principal to ensure that I'm creating the conditions in my school community for teachers to learn and thrive. Because if I'm really interested in improving student learning, then we can't keep doing what we've always been doing. We have to learn new ways of doing our work. And so that means being beginners again at things, or sort of fumbling around in unknown territory. And that requires people to feel a sense of acceptance, a sense of security within this new territory that they're entering, that they're trying to learn their ways into. And so I think it's super important for leaders to be creating the conditions for adults to do that kind of risk taking and learning. And I just think you can't underestimate that. You can't underestimate how important it is for folks to trust each other when they're at a team meeting and they're talking about the fact that they tried that strategy and it didn't work, or something came up and they didn't know how to respond. It's much easier for them to remain silent about that and not share, and then not learn as much. It's much harder for them to take the risk and talk about that with colleagues and then potentially grow together. So yeah, I absolutely see that parallel, Tracey. I agree with you.
Wonderful. Yeah. Creating the conditions, right? And there's no roadmap on how to do that, right? So when you're thinking about a veteran principal picking up becoming a school principal, right? They're picking up the book. They have 10 plus years of experience. They're a very experienced educator in terms of classroom teacher, but also now they're a veteran principal. What do you hope that they would get from becoming a school principal?
Well, a lot of the same lessons, frankly. I'm not sure that it gets any easier to be humble the more years of experience. In fact, maybe it's harder. So I think that lesson remains really important. I think the other thing that I learned from a coach who worked with me when I was a principal is the importance of building leadership at my school and thinking about how the work that I've done with teachers at my school to create these conditions for people to learn and take risks, how that will persist after I leave as a leader. So, thinking about what are the ways that I am building the leadership capacity of the teachers in this school so that the culture of the school is not at risk of changing when there's a leadership transition, so that the ways that we talk about student learning, the ways that we talk about our own learning, don't aren't uh, aren't disappeared, when aren't lessened, aren't diminished when a new leader comes in. Because unfortunately, that is something that we see over and over again, is that a school can work really hard, a leader can work really hard to build a particular culture in the school. But if it's too dependent on that one single person, when that leader leaves, things can backslide, things can retrograde, and we lose all of that growth. And so I think that's one of the things that I would really want everybody to be thinking about, but I think in particular the folks who've been in the role longer, how am I, in every action that I take as a leader, how am I thinking about how I'm ensuring that these actions are not dependent on me, that they're really coming from the staff, and that there are structures in place that allow that shared leadership to continue in a really solid way.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and that's really tricky, right? Sort of beginning your career or beginning your time in the school with the end in mind, and not all people don't often do that until like, oh, I'm going to be here for 6 months longer, and so let me start building that. Happens way before
Yeah.
that, and
Yeah.
not mistaking compliance for buy-in, right?
Mm.
Because it could look like as a leader, oh, everyone's on the same page, we're doing all the same practices, we're buying into the language. Now, is that actually buy-in, or is that compliance just because you're there? And when you
Mm.
leave, house of cards come down and it goes right back, right? And
Mm.
that's always the tricky question. And so moving on to your other work. So I don't want to sort of take them piece by piece, but I want to understand sort of the overall equity framework, right? Because you had a chapter in Becoming a School Principal. You wrote a book on unconscious bias in schools. You have instructional rounds. You do work with the National Seed Project. You're a lecturer. And I want to understand how that's guided, hopefully, by a central tenet being, because being an anti-racist educator doesn't stop when you leave a school building, right? It's a part of a through line to how we do our work. And so how does that work for you with these different aspects of how you lead leaders?
Well, I think it's core to my purpose as an educator. So my purpose, and the reason I became a teacher initially, was because I saw that Black and Brown students in the United States were not being given equal access to quality education. And I thought I could change that. I thought I could go in and be a really good teacher, and be a teacher who had really high standards for all my students, who loved all my students equally. And when I went in and did that as a teacher, and was really mentored by some amazing teachers of color who modeled what it meant to be a warm demander, I I learned a lot, and then wanted to support more teachers to do that. So wanted to become a principal. And then through my work, identifying myself as an anti-racist educator, both in the classroom and then in the school, came to understand so many of the blind spots that I had as a white leader. Really, a lot of that understanding came from working with you, Tracey, and in our collaboration, and in working with aspiring school leaders to really try to identify what are the skill sets and mindsets that school leaders need to have and that we as people supporting them need to build in order to ensure that all students are getting what they need to thrive in school and beyond. And so then I really realized, oh, my work is not in proving myself, my worthiness as an anti-racist educator, or proving that other people weren't doing the right work. My work was really in recognizing the ongoing journey of my learning as an anti-racist educator. It was sort of a slight shift in stance. And also, that was when I began to realize, oh, the injustice that I saw when I was initially deciding I wanted to become a teacher, this injustice of racism and the way that's manifesting in schools and in student learning outcomes, that issue of racism is really an issue that needs to be addressed by white people with white people. And so I'm understanding more and more that something really important that I need to do in my work as an anti-racist educator is work with white people increasingly to help. So, for example, I now do more and more work with groups of white principals or white superintendents to help all of us be thinking about how do we really claim anti-racism work as our responsibility. How does that shift the way I lead a team meeting or the kind of staff development I believe my teachers need, or the kinds of responsibilities I take in a mixed race group where there's a power differential or where we're advocating to the board? What kind of responsibility, what kind of role do I need to take as a white person? So I'm increasingly seeing the way that I use my role as an educator to work for justice is increasingly to think about how can I leverage my experience as a white person, my ongoing journey of learning as a white person, to support other white people in that work.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, and there's a lot of scholars who talk about that the impact of racism lies in the Black and brown community, and at the same time, those who are the receivers of the injustice shouldn't be the one having to lead it, right? Lead their own liberation, right? It has to be those who are in the position of sort of social and political power and economic power. And right now in the United States, it's white people, right? So, that ownership of the problem to solve the problem, I think, is very laudable, and it's part and parcel to be a leader for racial equity. And so, could you be a little bit more specific around what it means to be an anti-racist leader? Because according to the definition that I use, right, in the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute, is that to be an anti-racist educator is that we are purposely and deliberately, in part embarking on initiatives to alleviate oppression on communities of color. That we can validate that it actually does that in which it was intended to, right? And again, why our organization often comes in is because we find the district to have these sort of unintentionally performative actions, right? They'll celebrate, cultural events. They'll have, they'll say, okay, we're doing restorative justice for this case. We're doing, insert culture responsive teaching, right? We're going to train every teacher in culture responsive teaching, right? So we'll have all these adult actions that districts will take for years, right? And spend a lot of time, money, and energy. And then by the point that they look for us is because they've been doing it for so many years, but yet the outcomes on kids are still the same. Now, in your mind, how do we get folks out of that train of thought that just by doing these well-intended actions doesn't necessarily connect with anti-racism? Can we be more intentional around making sure that our actions match our outcomes?
Right. Well, I think a big part of the answer is recognizing the difference between intentions and impact. And I think that's just a huge area for growth in the field of education in general, that we focus a lot of our energy and a lot of our sense of self-worth on our intentions. So as you said, what are the statements that we've made around equity? What is our slogan around equity? Do we have the committees? Have we read the books? All of those things are about our intentions. And when we focus a lot of attention there, we can feel kind of self-congratulatory because you can check off a list. Wow, we've done a lot of things. Our intentions are so good. And that's different from what our impact is, as you say. And a commitment to really focusing on impact means I, as a leader, we as a district need to hold ourselves accountable for actually making a material difference in students' experiences in school. And so we need to be able to define, what does thriving really look like? Is it just test scores? Test scores are super important because they are a ticket to lots of opportunities for kids in the future, but it's not just test scores. Are kids feeling like they are valued, like they're perceived as important members of the school community? Are kids feeling a sense of belonging, et cetera? Are kids feeling like they have agency in their learning? All of that. So we determine these measures, the ways that we would want to guarantee that all of our graduates are feeling. And then we find ways to measure that. And then we consider our success as shifting things around impact, not as shifting things around intention. I mean, they aren't totally separate, right? They, there's intersection, but I think there's been this disassociation that has been really harmful. And I think it's also harmful in terms of, the research that we know around collective efficacy, which is I feel more motivated to do this work of improvement when I see that my actions are causing an improvement in the thing that I care about. And if I get that feedback loop regularly, I'm more and more invested in doing the kind of work I'm doing to get better. And when we think about collective efficacy around anti-racist education or educational development or educator development, we really need to get that feedback loop where I made this change and I have a way of measuring whether it made a material difference for students. Because then if I see that there is a connection between a change that I made and an impact on student learning in ways that I care about, then I'm more and more motivated to do it. And if I don't, as you were just describing, if I feel like I'm spinning my wheels, I'm more and more likely to say, this isn't working, and then to probably put blame on kids. So you know what? It probably is the kid's fault. If only kids showed up differently, et cetera, et cetera. And it really backfires and undermines a lot of work. So ironically, a lot of districts who may have invested a lot of energy in that work around our good intentions may be creating the conditions to diminish the commitment of faculty in their schools and districts to do this work, because there's that feeling of being on a hamster wheel. So I think it's crucial that we have really specific measures that we can use to ensure that we're having the impact that we want, and ensure that kids are actually getting what they deserve and need in school. So yeah, 100% agree with you on that. And it's tricky because so for example, when we collect data about culture in schools, we don't always disaggregate it. I mean, you've been such a strong advocate for this. When I asked the teaching fellow in my class to collect data about student participation, and I asked him to disaggregate it by race, by gender, and for us to then think about, if I want this class to be a place where everyone feels like they can participate, what might I be doing or not doing that is producing the results in our student participation that we have? So thinking about what is the kind of data that we're going to collect, I think is a really important piece of this. It's not always as straightforward as just test data. Is there culture data? Is there participation data? Is there data around the safety that students feel? Even young children, even first graders can talk about, are there places in the school where I don't feel safe? In predominantly white schools, are the bathrooms places where kids of color may be tormented? And that comes up when you do one of those safety maps where you're letting young children indicate, where do I not feel safe? And then disaggregating that by race. So anyway, just to say, it's challenging, but there are really creative and I think helpful ways for people to collect that impact data that then can help people actually have the impact that they're intending to have, which then builds that collective efficacy and drives further improvement.
And so the final
Can I say
question I
one more
want,
thing about that?
oh, oh yeah, absolutely.
Just one more quick thing, because we just talked about this in my class last week when we were reading the fabulous book, Despite the Best Intentions by John Diamond and Amanda Lewis. And they talk about the difference between ostensive aspects of routines and performative aspects. And it's basically, I think you referred to this earlier also, but just this need for us not to be satisfied that the written policies in our school or the unwritten rules of engagement in the classroom and staff meetings and hiring practices are egalitarian, that they are equity centered. To not be satisfied with those intentions being codified, that actually doesn't matter if, when we start to examine how they are enacted, we find that they're enacted in very inequitable ways. And in fact, that's what they talk about in their book, which my students were finding so helpful to, again, get underneath, well, wait a minute, this school seems to have all the right policies in place. Why aren't we getting equitable outcomes? And again, there's this temptation to then say, if we have all the right policies, the inequitable outcomes must reflect students. And so what was so powerful about this research was for students to see, don't stop there. When you see the inequitable outcomes, if we're really starting from the premise that all students can thrive and achieve at high levels, then we have to go back and question more what we're doing. And this framing of ostensive aspects of routines and performative aspects of routines helps us recognize, we have to actually examine more closely the ways we're enacting these routines. So whether that is process mapping or doing more observation, but getting that data is really essential.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Because there's a people aspect to it, right? The written policy and the way it's written could seem that it's
Right.
equitable, but the people have to enact it. We have all of our biases that are in
Right.
that, and we get into group things. The final question I have is, it's a deep question, but I think it's very important, and you can go with it where you may, because I'm not sure about how comfortable and how safe you feel around it. But you work with the National Seed Project and today's political climate. What is your advice for how the folks that you work with should either weather the storm and remain committed to the sort of core tenets of the Seed Project within this political climate? What do you say that those who are you're working with currently the project, but also those who are listening to this podcast that are feeling very distraught, are feeling that I can't even speak the words in my school district, right? Because I might be fired. And so, what are your recommendations for weathering the storm and also being productive?
Well, first of all, I do not pretend to have answers to this because I just think it's such a hard question. And let me think about it on two different levels. So, one is on a personal level, I've had white leaders come to me and say some version of, I just feel paralyzed. I feel, full of despair. And I just basically feeling paralyzed by despair, and feeling that there are insurmountable challenges now that are shutting down all of our good intentions. And I guess what I have been trying to think about, and what I have shared with white leaders who share that with me, just from a sort of personal, how am I moving through the challenges of our current political climate, is I have heard so many Black women say, well, think about what Black women have faced for years, or people of color in general. But I really have heard a lot of Black women saying so clearly, This is the work to persist. Yes, Black women have felt the bottom of the bottom of the heap by so many measures in our society, and have been oppressed in so many different ways, and continue to be the leaders of so many social justice movements, continue to wake up in the face of that oppression and persist, take risks, be courageous, make justice the center of their work. And so that helps me as a white person feeling despair think about how I can't feel immobilized. I can't feel sort of, I guess I can't feel defeated, because I have this model of people who were experiencing so many layers of oppression that I am not, who have led in such powerful ways and persist in leading and persist in claiming joy. So I share that as an example that I've really been trying to learn from. And I guess then the professional piece is, I think when we think about positionality, I mean, this is sort of the obvious answer. When we think about positionality, when it's possible and when I'm in a multiracial space, so when it's possible, meaning when this conversation comes up, when it's not going to undermine work for all of the students, whom I'm responsible for, when there are possible openings to see my role within this climate as a white person with privilege to say the hard thing. So that feels really important. And I guess when there are circumstances that mean, no, actually, it's not possible. If I speak out right now, we will lose all of our funding, or we will lose all of this, to then think about, okay, so how am I building relationships? How am I doing all of the infrastructure work so that when there are opportunities, we can grab them? So how are we investing in trust building? How are we investing in centering student learning? That's a pretty, I think, dissatisfying answer, because it is within the context of places where the risk is so great that they'll lose funding. I mean, that's contrasted with an example that I heard from a colleague of mine who is a Black school board member, and in a district that was threatened with losing their funding if they did not cut all sorts of programs that were aligned with their social justice values. And she said she asked her colleagues on the board, well, how much do our values cost? How much are we willing to pay to maintain these values? And, in some cases, there may be the resources to say, all right, that's how much our values cost, and that's what we're going to now need to pay. In other situations, I think there are certainly examples of places where we don't have that money to pay, and so we are going to need to make compromises and do that work of building the infrastructure so that we're able to take advantage of the opportunities that we can take advantage of. I think the sort of essential element is, how am I, as somebody who has considerable privilege, thinking about the actions that I can take and considering the risks that it means to me as significantly less than the risks that those same actions would require of people with different identities from mine. So immigrants, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community. I mean, so there's so many people who have identities different from mine who are so at risk right now, so under threat right now. And so how can I make sure that I'm speaking, even if there is risk to me, recognizing that it's so much less? I'm buffered in so many ways. Again, I say that knowing there are times when taking that risk could ultimately impact losing funding for kids. And I have to weigh all of those things. I have a lot of respect for the people who are having to grapple with this because it's so hard.
Wonderful. Yeah. And there's no easy answer, right? And the worst thing we can do is just be complacent and, just be apathetic about it and say, well, I can't right now. The environment won't let me do it, right? To do something, but like you say, be strategic, right? And what that action is it something that is in service of furthering the cause or may cause actual more harm than good in this current political climate? But I agree, there's no easy answer. This has been another episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Research Institute podcast. This has been a conversation with Dr. Sarah Fiarman. Check out her books at Harvard Education Press, Instructional Rounds in Education, Becoming a School Principal, and Unconscious Bias in Schools. I want to really appreciate you for agreeing to come on my podcast.
It's my honor, Tracey. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.